Consider Mrs. Hill's 5 rules today. Hey, welcome. We're taking another look into the life of Elisabeth Elliot, who called us to live to a high standard and not settle for a little religion in life. Our series continues in the coming weeks as we hear from family, friends, and others, all influenced by the life and message of Elisabeth Elliot. Hey, thanks for joining us today. Well, today we wrap up our short series on the happy child as we have parts 3 and 4, Mrs. Hill's 5 rules for child rearing, and more guidelines for child rearing. We'll hear from one of the granddaughters of Elisabeth Elliot, Elisabeth Martin, who will talk about a family tendency to worry and about the value of hymns. And a listener comment as well later on from Nicole. Stay tuned. Right now, part 3 of The Happy Child. Elisabeth said the process of shaping the child shapes also the mother herself. Reverence for her sacred burden calls her to all that is pure and good, that she may teach primarily by her own humble, daily example. So, what are those 5 rules?
You are loved with an everlasting love. That's what the Bible says. And underneath are the everlasting arms. This is your friend Elisabeth Elliot talking with you this time about the happy child. I have said that I'm no expert, so today I'm going to pass on what one mother of the early part of this century wrote about the way their home was run. I happen to be the beneficiary of this training, not because she was my mother, but because her daughter was my history teacher. I went to a little school in Florida called Hampton DuBose Academy. My history teacher was Miss Hill, and I'm convinced that Miss Hill must have been a very happy child, and now that I have just recently read some of her mother's suggestions for rearing happy children, I think I understand a little bit more about what made Miss Hill so cheerful. She was a very pretty, very slim, dark-haired lady with a nice singing voice, and she used to lead us in singing in chapel and vespers with tremendous vigor and a good, strong voice. I don't know how she got so much out of us, but she was wonderful at drawing the music out of us high school kids. She was an almost invariably cheerful, self-giving person, but she was also very strict. I remember the day that I took a couple of baby possums to history class. I've always been fascinated by animals, and particularly fascinated with baby animals, and one of the boys had captured a mother possum who had a whole string of babies clinging to her tail, and he let me have a couple of these, and so I took them to history class, thinking that I could conceal them on my lap underneath my books. We were sitting in a circle, and unfortunately, Miss Hill noticed the possums and insisted that I leave the class and return the possums to their owner. And on another occasion, I can remember saying something very sarcastic. This probably happened a good many times because God knows it's been one of my besetting sins, and I can still see her piercing eyes looking at me over the top of her glasses as she said, "Betty Howard, we will have no more caustic remarks." Well, dear Miss Hill, she lives in Florida, in a retirement community, I think, and she's one of the listeners to Gateway to Joy. Not very long ago, she sent me a paper that her mother had written, I think at her behest, shortly before she died, explaining how she got her children to be obedient. And the paper is called Obedient Children? Why Not? This is the way she begins. As a great-grandmother, I have watched with alarm the growing tendency to lack of discipline in the homes. My own experience may sound archaic, but fundamental principles are timeless. May I venture a few suggestions that served well in caring for our family of 2 daughters and 2 sons, the oldest just 6 when number 4 arrived? The neighbors had commented, "How do you do it? We've never known a family with small children to have so much company." In a casual way, I did know how, but perhaps the time had come to give some thought to the need for a few rules to ensure the happy atmosphere for 3, as well as for the first 2. So, as occasions arose and were peacefully solved, the rules gradually took root and were registered for future use by Mama. Now here she gives us 5 rules. Did they work? Yes, they did, not only through the early years, but also through the teenage period. For serious consideration, here they are. Number 1, be sure you say what you mean and mean what you say. No is no, and yes is yes, the first time. If a request is inconvenient for Mama, why not respond, "No, dear, Mama's busy, some other time," with a smile and maybe a kiss. Easy, but don't forget that other time, in case a response is still needed. And may I add my own parenthesis in here. I can remember having some promises made to me by relatives when I was a small child, promises of very exciting things. Those promises never came true, and I have never forgotten the almost sickness of disappointment that I felt when the promises were not carried out. I was glad to see that Mrs. Hill says, don't forget that other time. If you've put your child off and said some other time, then make sure you give him some other time. Her second suggestion, tell the truth always. You can't expect a child to be truthful if you are not. And don't make the mistake to think they won't know it if you are not. And my parenthesis under this, my parents were very strict about telling the truth. I think I've probably mentioned on an earlier program that more than once I had my mouth washed out with soap because I had told a lie. Maybe what people nowadays would call a white lie, but all lies were black in our house, and my parents insisted on the strictest regard for the truth. They themselves set the example for us in this by never telling us that there is a Santa Claus. They told us all about Santa Claus, and we were allowed to have Santa Clauses on the Christmas tree and Santa Clauses on our Christmas cards if we wanted to. But the emphasis was on the fact that this was the birthday of Jesus Christ. My parents' idea was that once you start that kind of a story, if you only want to call it a story, it has to be supported by a fabric of lies, and that they could not tolerate. Mrs. Hill's third suggestion, make no promises, the most flagrant error of all. For example, be good. If I get a good report, I'll have a present for you. Good behavior should be the norm. Bribery inculcates false values, particularly if the promised reward has been forgotten, doubling the damage already done. And that echoes my parents' view that you don't give rewards for every time a child obeys or does his duty, because duty and obedience were taken for granted as the ground rules of our home. It was nothing extraordinary that deserved some special favor. Don't forget to compliment the child and point out that you're pleased with his performance, but it doesn't require a piece of candy. Mrs. Hill's fourth suggestion, consider the motive. Take time to do this when anything off routine occurs. Wait before scolding or spanking. What appears as a deliberate act calling for some parental recognition usually turns out to be an incident easily solved when the circumstances are known. Maybe this is a situation where a child learns the parent will be fair and listen to his side of what happened, a worthwhile link in building up the parent-child relationship. That points up the fact that it isn't always easy to know whether this apparently naughty thing that a child has done was deliberate disobedience or whether, in fact, he had misunderstood you, or you had never actually forbidden the thing. Mrs. Hill's advice is very good. What was the child's motive? Take time to discover it. Try to think if there's a possible misunderstanding, and wait before scolding or spanking. And then, number 5, a final word: no evasions, no letdowns. It does work. No evasions. Tell the children the truth. Tell them straight. That doesn't mean that you can always tell the children all the truth. There are many things that they need not have explained to them. There are many things they cannot understand. But within reason and within the scope of the child's understanding and experience, be very careful that you don't evade the truth. I would especially issue a warning here about evading the truth about the death of someone they love. Because adults, generally speaking, are so deathly afraid of death themselves and evade discussion of it and even the contemplation of their own death. We project that fear of death onto the children, which they would not have if they didn't learn it from us. Be very straightforward. When my friend Essie died, my parents took me to the funeral. I know of cases where a child has been sheltered from even knowing about the death of a loved one for a long time. That makes it much more difficult for the child to accept. Remember that children can face facts with far more equanimity than we adults can. So, no evasions. Once again, Mrs. Hill's 5 rules. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Tell the truth always. Make no promises. Consider the motive. And no evasions. Thank you, Miss Hill, for giving us your mother's rules.
Mrs. Hill's 5 Rules for Child Rearing, The Happy Child, Part 3. We'll conclude this 4-part look at that subject in just a little bit. First, though, let's hear from Elisabeth Martin. We caught up with her by way of Zoom. She talked about a tendency to worry and about the value of hymns.
She had so many hymns in her head and heart. She memorized so many hymns because her parents brought her up to sing hymns. I think the hymns helped solidify the deep theology that she had been taught, but also reminded her in poetry form what she was supposed to do. Because sometimes we do get so indecisive in life, and there are so many choices of what I could spend my time doing. She did tell me once, you come from a long line of champion warriors. And at first I thought, well, is that supposed to encourage me? It was supposed to encourage me, because what she was saying right after that was, we're going to pray about this. You're obviously worried. We're going to pray about it. And so the reason she was telling me you come from a long line of champion warriors was because she was one. And she saw in me that I was a lot like her. And so she wanted me to be encouraged that she could empathize with me, but also that here's what we do. When we worry, we go to the cross. We go to the Lord. We bring our troubles to Him. And that hymn, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, I can still hear her voice singing. What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. She lived that.
Elisabeth Martin, one of the granddaughters of Elisabeth Elliot. Later on, we'll be hearing from a listener and a testimony of Elisabeth's influence in her life. Nicole will be up in a little bit. First, though, let's wrap up the Happy Child series, more guidelines for child rearing. If you've raised children, do you ever feel a threat to your freedom? Do you feel like it just takes too much time? Elisabeth said, freedom begins way back. It begins not with doing what you want, but with doing what you ought. That is, with discipline. She said, I'm convinced that there is nothing that can happen to me in this life that is not precisely designed by a sovereign Lord to give me the opportunity to learn to know Him.
This is your friend, Elisabeth Elliot, talking with you again about the happy child. Yesterday, I read to you 5 rules for getting obedience and having happy children, which were sent to me by my old history teacher, Miss Hill, who is now retired, and her mother, Mrs. Hill, has gone to be with the Lord. But Miss Hill sent me these rules, and I felt that they were every bit as relevant today as they were back when she wrote them, and back at the beginning of this century when she drew up this set of rules for her 4 children. So here are some more. No one in our house shouted at anyone about anything at any time. But even that needs a warning. This is rule number 1 for today. I gave you 5 yesterday. I'm going to give you 5 today. No shouting. But even that needs a warning. Only recently, our oldest told me how grateful she has been that the tent gang, an acquired designation when about 5, 7, 9, and 11, never were subjected to parental arguments, jokingly called amicable disagreements. One memoir serves to emphasize the point. Apparently the head of the house and Mama had become over-enthusiastic about something and had unconsciously raised their voices. Suddenly from our 3-year-old darling in her high chair, with tears so near, came the pleading cry, "Daddy, love Mama! Mama, love Daddy!" Such a heartfelt cry had to be taken seriously. Not until we had assured our tot that her daddy and mama were not cross, then, and not until then, did we venture a laugh to ease the others who had refrained from chiding us for talking too loud. What a lesson for parents. Sometime before that incident, the other son had completed that hoped-for quartet of 2 daughters and 2 sons. Number 3 always said, "We never had a chance to be spoiled." The Midnight Express arrived at 6 degrees above zero the day after Christmas. You don't have to imagine what it meant to that household to have a well-behaved trio that loved the new baby, to say nothing of giving Grandma and the part-time helpers no bother. Incidentally, the bedtime call at 7:30 operated smoothly, regardless of who called it, as also the call to lunch when playing outdoors. So this brings us to Mrs. Hill's second principle for today. Children come when called. The bedtime call operated smoothly, even though the parents were not there, and also the call to lunch. The third rule, observing table amenities. Perhaps this is the place to mention one result of observing the table amenities, she writes. A helper preparing lunch for the trio grumbled at the family routine, to which the 6-year-old daughter advised her, "Our mama does the same for us as she does for our daddy." That involved sitting at the dining room table for nearly all meals. Then the rest of this sentence brings us to rule number 4, a brief Bible reading and prayer at the evening one. So they were sitting at the dining room table for all meals with a brief Bible reading and prayer at the evening one. Surprised? Yes, through high school days, no absentees, and still appreciated after 50 years. Now, to me, that's proof of what a happy and peaceful home it must have been. And this next story she tells corroborates that. When baby number 4 had adjusted to a somewhat unusual start in life, and now at 4 months lay peacefully asleep in his carriage, little sister came rushing in from outdoor play, screaming, "Grasshoppers, grasshoppers, all over me, all over me!" With that, the dear baby nearly woke up and joined the concert. Question? 2 little precious ones in need of immediate comfort, and only 1 pair of hands. Mama gave up on the grasshoppers and picked up the baby, really terrified in such a racket. Then, for the first and only time, she called the nearest neighbor. Relieved of the baby, the young lady and I went to the playroom where all the garments were removed and turned wrong side out to prove no grasshoppers. The crying quit, but not the scare. Clothes? No, indeed, no. Finally, the hopeless chase ended with all fresh clothing from upstairs. The climax to that incident followed the neighbor's remark, "Mrs. Hill, I had no idea you have so much to do. You really do need help." With only 50 feet of lawn between our homes, my trio need no comment. Can you imagine that the neighbor had no idea that she really needed such help? She probably didn't even realize that she had 4 children next door. Then she gives some very interesting comments on how to deal with fear. Up until now, there had been no evidence of fear on the part of the older children. So it came as a real surprise when I returned one day to have May report that the 3 had come into the playroom, closed the door, and crawled under their table in the corner. The reason? The old man who came along often with his warning heard a block or more away, "Here comes the old rag man, here comes the old rag man." A junk cart, a skinny horse, a whip, and a big floppy hat with a wide blue band boasting big bows also flopping did present a rather awesome picture, plus maybe 200 pounds of flesh. I told May not to be upset, but I thanked her for telling me as part of her duties. Next time I heard, "Here comes the old rag man," I had already put some papers aside to give him so he would need to come to the basement. As he took care of that, I called to the trio who had left their play outdoors and gone to their playroom to come down the steps to the basement. Back to rule number 2, blessed obedience. It works. They came when called. Meantime, I had briefed the jolly old fellow, and he took over as they stayed on the steps. "I like little boys and girls, I sure do." On and on as he searched through his change for 3 shiny pennies. I could feel little sister's tenseness when I told them to thank the man and shake hands with him. The old man said goodbye and continued with his advance warning. The trio returned to their outdoor play with whatever fears they had picked up, somehow completely removed. Especially in a day when psychology hadn't reached the everyday vocabulary, the foundation of the rules for myself may have been laid when my naturally practical mind decided that children necessarily would someday be adults. I'm still reading from Mrs. Hill's paper, but isn't that charming? The realization that children necessarily will someday be adults. We forget that, don't we? Why not gradually acquire traits or habits that will later prove helpful to them, and meanwhile help to maintain a wholesome atmosphere in the home? Frankly, they amazed many in the process, including even their mama at times, but surely it contributed to our having so many of our city friends visit us in the suburbs. By now you're thinking, all that sounds too good to be true even at home. What about away from home? Take church. We had no junior church services, no babysitters. Until number 4 had 3 birthdays, Daddy and Mama alternated at the morning service. After that, we could take all 4, 3, 5, 7, and 9. No books to scribble in and annoy others, no crackers. Bible reading and prayer at home meant sit still and listen. And may I put in my own parenthesis here, we had the same thing in our home. Having to sit still, sit up, not play with things, not be squirming around in our seats during family devotions was good practice for sitting up and sitting still and not squirming in church. Mrs. Hill says we could take our quartet anywhere without any concern of embarrassment. They were ladies and gentlemen. As a family, we found the welcome mat always out for all 6 of us. To strengthen the argument for my rules, alone I could take all 4 to the city by electric train and subway that included quite a few steps. Big sister held little sister by the hand, big brother could care for himself, and Mama had little brother. On one trip with little sister just past 3 to have a photo taken, a distinguished-looking gentleman sat down beside her on the way home. Soon they were chatting like old friends, and eventually my little lady was asked, "Do you have any brothers and sisters?" "Yes, sir. I have 2 brothers and 1 sister." And then turning to me, And this is my mama, Mrs. Hill. What else could she do? I looked up to be polite, but the other party, too amused to keep a straight face, turned his head the other way. However, leaving before we did, this fine gentleman had regained his natural courtesy, turned at the exit, smiled, tipped his derby hat, and made a little bow. What more can be said? Maybe no slammed doors should be included, no jumping down the stairs. We didn't do either, and only recently did I learn that Daddy had taught them to turn the knob forward before opening the door. Now, all of those things fit under the heading of courtesy. Let me go back to Mrs. Hill's 5 rules for today. No shouting. Number 2, come when you're called. Number 3, table manners. Number 4, Bible reading and prayer. Number 5, courtesy. In church, on the train, at home, and to the neighbors. No slammed doors, no jumping on stairs. Those are just simple matters of courtesy. Teach your children what Paul said. No man lives to himself, and no man dies to himself. We must think of others. May God help you to have a peaceful home and happy children for His glory.
The Happy Child, Part 4, the conclusion of our short series, More Guidelines for Child Rearing, today's lesson. Well, some of you have taken the time to let us know how Elisabeth has affected your life. Here are a few thoughts from Nicole.
I wanted to express my sincere gratitude towards Elisabeth Elliot and the Gateway of Joy Ministry, and I greatly admire her obedience to the Lord, especially in times of uncertainty, how she put all of her trust and faith into the Lord when it came to doing the next thing, no matter the cost, which has also greatly inspired me in my life. When it comes to seasons of uncertainty, I remind myself to do the next thing and to have courage and to place my trust in the Lord. And she has truly become a spiritual mother to me, and I will always be grateful for her and her ministry.
Well, thank you, Nicole. Well, as our time together comes to an end, thanks for letting us come into your home, your office, maybe along with you as you took a jog, wherever we found you today. On behalf of the Elisabeth Elliot Foundation, in cooperation with the Bible Broadcasting Network, let me invite you to check out all the resources, such as more talks, more Gateway to Joy programs, videos, and more, at elisabethelliot.org. You can leave a message for us if you'd like to do that there. Look for the podcast section and then the Share a Message button. elisabethelliot.org. Until next time, may God remind you each day, you are loved with an everlasting love, and underneath are the everlasting arms